Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. Winter of 1876, Pine Ridge County, Montana Territory. The sound of hammering echoed across the snow-dusted valley floor as Josiah Thatcher worked methodically at his homestead. Though a late arrival to the settlement, the 40-year-old carpenter from Vermont approached his cabin's construction with a precision that puzzled his neighbors. The winter chill was already settling in, yet there he was, meticulously adding a double-walled section to his modest cabin's northern exposure. "Why, Thatcher's building like he's facing a Quebec winter," muttered Samuel Donovan, a bearded settler who'd arrived 2 years prior. "Man's wasting daylight on fancy woodwork when he should be getting his stores ready." Indeed, Josiah's cabin had become something of a curiosity in the small community of Pine Ridge. The settlement, little more than 20 homesteads scattered across the valley, had formed its own customs and rhythms over the 5 years since its founding. Newcomers were expected to follow certain unwritten protocols, build quickly, hunt and gather abundantly, and prepare for winter according to local wisdom. But Josiah, with his Eastern background and methodical ways, seemed determined to follow his own path. The community's skepticism deepened when word spread about the stove Josiah had hauled all the way from Billings. Samuel Donovan and 3 other men had ridden over to inspect the new arrival's progress, offering the customary neighborly assessment that masked competitive scrutiny. "That's your heating setup?" Samuel asked, staring at the cast-iron contraption Josiah was carefully positioning on a stone hearth. "That little box won't last you through November." The stove was indeed smaller than the massive cast-iron boxes that dominated most cabin common rooms in the territory. Josiah's model stood barely 3 feet tall, with an unusual configuration of air vents and a compact firebox that seemed impossibly small for the harsh Montana winters. "Vermont defiant," Josiah replied simply, running his hand along the smooth cast iron. "Been using this design back east for years now." "Well, this ain't the east," Samuel said, the other men nodding in agreement. "First heavy snow, you'll be begging to share someone else's fire." Josiah merely nodded, continuing his work without argument. The men exchanged glances, another mark against the newcomer who wouldn't heed local advice. The meeting at Donovan's cabin that evening buzzed with speculation about Thatcher's peculiar choices. Pine Ridge had developed its own hierarchy based largely on who had survived the most winters and whose methods had proven most effective. The consensus on Josiah's prospects was grim. "The man's got fancy ideas, but no sense," declared Walter Keene, a grizzled homesteader whose massive heating stove consumed nearly a cord of wood every 2 weeks. "That toy stove won't heat half his cabin." Only Jakob Müller, an elderly German immigrant who rarely joined such gatherings, offered a different perspective. "Small stoves, they can work if built right," he said quietly. "My grandfather in the Black Forest used such methods." "Much depends on the design." His comment was quickly dismissed. The settlers of Pine Ridge had developed their own understanding of winter survival, and they were confident in their methods. They burned through enormous quantities of firewood, maintaining roaring fires in oversized stoves that required constant feeding and produced extreme heat that quickly dissipated through poorly insulated walls. It was inefficient but familiar, and familiarity bred confidence. As October turned to November and the first light snowfall dusted the valley, the community watched with a mixture of concern and curiosity as Josiah completed his cabin preparations. Unlike his neighbors, who had stacked massive wood piles next to their doors, Josiah's woodshed contained what appeared to be a modest supply, though arranged with unusual care. Split logs stacked in an alternating pattern that maximized airflow. "Won't last a month," was Samuel's assessment, as he rode past one crisp morning. Josiah, measuring and cutting lengths of stovepipe, merely nodded in acknowledgment. To understand the community's skepticism, one must appreciate the brutal reality of Montana winters in the 1870s. The territory was still raw and largely untamed, with settlements scattered across valleys and mountains. Pine Ridge, nestled in a basin surrounded by low mountains, had been established in 1871 by a small group of determined homesteaders seeking land and opportunity following the Civil War. Many came from more temperate regions of the East and Midwest, and their first winter had been a harsh awakening to frontier realities. 2 of the original 12 families had perished that first year, one from illness, another from a cabin fire that started when they tried to intensify their heating by modifying their stove. The survivors had learned through bitter experience that Montana winters demanded respect and abundant preparation. By the winter of 1876, the settlement had established what they considered proven methods for survival: massive wood stockpiles, oversized stoves kept perpetually hot, and close attention to weather patterns that might signal approaching storms. Josiah Thatcher's arrival in the spring of 1876 had initially been welcomed. New settlers brought needed skills and resources to the small community. A widower with no children, Josiah had spent most of his life in the mountains of Vermont, where he'd worked as a carpenter and cabinet maker. His craftsmanship was immediately evident. His hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had spent decades mastering his trade. But as summer turned to fall, Josiah's approaches to building and preparation began to raise eyebrows. While other settlers focused on expanding their fields or hunting to build up winter food stores, Josiah spent weeks on what seemed like excessive refinements to his modest cabin, adding insulation, creating a complex ventilation system, and constructing storage spaces with peculiar attention to airflow. "Man's priorities are backwards," Walter Keene had commented in September, watching Josiah carefully chinking the spaces between logs with a mixture of clay, grass, and lime that he'd prepared with unusual care. "Food and fuel come first out here. Pretty work comes later, if at all." The arrival of Josiah's stove had been the final confirmation for many that the newcomer didn't understand frontier realities. The stove had come on one of the last freight wagons before winter would make the mountain passes treacherous. The freight driver had needed Samuel Donovan's help to unload the cast iron piece, and word had quickly spread throughout the small community. "Paid a small fortune to ship it," the freight driver had told Samuel, said it had to be this exact model, wouldn't consider anything local. This extravagance seemed to epitomize Eastern impracticality to the settlers. In a place where every resource was precious and practical value determined worth, spending extra on a specialized stove seemed the height of folly, especially when that stove appeared inadequate for the task it would face. By mid-November, the first serious storm arrived, blanketing the valley in 18 inches of snow and sending temperatures plummeting. The settlers of Pine Ridge retreated to their cabins, stoking their massive stoves to combat the bitter cold. The rhythm of winter had begun. The constant feeding of fires, the daily collection of more wood, the battle against the elements that would continue for months. 3 days after the storm, Samuel and Walter rode to check on the newcomer, half expecting to find him in distress. Instead, they found Josiah calmly working at his desk near a window, the interior of his cabin surprisingly warm, despite the modest fire visible through the stove's small iron door. "You're burning mighty small for this weather," Samuel observed, removing his gloves as the unexpected warmth of the cabin enveloped him. "Don't need much," Josiah replied. "Stove's designed to maximize the heat from each log, and the cabin helps keep it in." The 2 visitors exchanged skeptical glances. Such ideas ran counter to everything they knew about winter survival. A big fire meant safety. Anything less invited disaster. What neither man fully appreciated in that moment was that they were witnessing the collision of 2 different approaches to frontier survival. One based on the abundance of resources that characterized the early American frontier, and another rooted in the resource scarcity that had shaped New England life for generations. The Montana Territory in the 1870s still embodied the frontier ethos of seemingly limitless natural wealth. Forests appeared boundless, game was abundant, and the scattered human settlements made minimal impact on the landscape. This abundance shaped the settlers' approach to winter survival. They cut vast quantities of wood, maintained roaring fires, and focused on brute force solutions to the challenge of cold. Josiah Thatcher, however, came from a region where centuries of settlement had taught different lessons. Vermont's winters were no less severe than Montana's, but its forests had been harvested for generations. Wood was precious, and communities had developed sophisticated techniques to maximize heating efficiency. The Vermont Defiant stove was a product of this conservation mindset, designed not for environments where wood was abundant, but for those where it was increasingly scarce. The technical innovations embodied in Josiah's stove represented generations of practical knowledge. Unlike the simple box designs common on the frontier, the Defiant featured a complex internal structure with multiple air channels and baffles. Cold air was drawn in near the bottom, circulated around the fire chamber to be preheated, and then introduced precisely where it would create the most complete combustion. The result was a fire that burned hotter but consumed less wood, with minimal waste in the form of smoke or unburned material. Similarly, Josiah's cabin construction reflected techniques developed over centuries in cold climates with limited resources. The double-wall construction created a dead air space that acted as insulation, while careful sealing of gaps prevented the heat leakage that plagued many frontier cabins. His attention to ventilation ensured that the cabin remained fresh without losing excessive heat, addressing the common frontier problem of cabins that were either stuffy and smoky or drafty and cold. December arrived with unusual ferocity that year. Historical records from the Pine Ridge County Courthouse would later document it as one of the harshest winters in territorial memory, with temperatures reaching 30 below zero by mid-month. The settlement fell into a state of constant vigilance against the cold, with men and women working in shifts to maintain fires through the night. The brutality of that December tested even the most experienced settlers. Daily routines became dominated by the constant need for wood, cutting, hauling, splitting, stacking, feeding into stoves in a never-ending cycle. Children were kept home from the settlement's small schoolhouse as parents deemed it too dangerous to risk the walk in such temperatures. Families huddled around their stoves, burning through their carefully gathered supplies at an alarming rate. At the community gathering held in the Donovan cabin before Christmas, conversation inevitably turned to winter preparations and who among them was struggling. Talk eventually circled to Josiah, who had declined the invitation, citing work he needed to complete. "Man still standing," admitted Samuel, "though I can't figure how. Burning half what any of us do." "Can't last," Walter insisted. "Physics don't change because he's stubborn." Jacob Miller, warming his hands by Donovan's massive stove, spoke up again. "I visited Thatcher yesterday. His method has intelligence to it. The stove has baffles inside, channels the heat differently. And he's built his cabin walls with a dead air space." This revelation prompted more discussion, but few were convinced. Decades of frontier wisdom couldn't be overturned by a newcomer's strange ideas, especially when those ideas suggested that much of their labor might be unnecessary. The gathering that evening also revealed another dimension of frontier life that is often overlooked in romanticized accounts: the physical toll of the constant battle against the elements. Several men showed signs of injury from woodcutting accidents, common when fatigue combined with the urgent need for fuel. Martha Keene, Walter's wife, mentioned that her husband had been coughing badly since Thanksgiving, likely from the perpetual smoke that filled their cabin, despite their best efforts with the chimney. Emma Donovan, serving coffee to the gathered neighbors, added her own observation. "I've noticed Thatcher's chimney hardly smokes at all. Even when his stove is going, ours billows like a steamboat even on good days." This comment, seemingly minor, highlighted another advantage of Josiah's system that few had considered. The more efficient combustion in his stove meant less smoke production, which translated to better air quality inside the cabin and reduced creosote buildup in the chimney, a common cause of dangerous chimney fires on the frontier. As the evening progressed and the visitors departed for their own homes, Samuel found himself reflecting on Jacob's words and his wife's observation. Though he wouldn't admit it publicly, the constant demand for wood was wearing on him. Already his supply was diminishing faster than he had anticipated, and winter had barely begun. The prospect of having to venture into the forest for more cutting during the coldest months was concerning. If there was a better way, even one introduced by an outsider, perhaps it warranted consideration. January 1877 brought what old-timers would later call the Great Freezing. For 16 days, temperatures never rose above zero, and howling winds created deadly conditions that confined everyone to their homes. The settlement entered survival mode, with all attention focused on maintaining heat and rationing supplies. The historical record of this period comes primarily from journal entries and letters preserved by the families of Pine Ridge. Emma Donovan's diary provides particularly vivid descriptions of the conditions. January 8, 1877. The cold has a presence now, like some malevolent creature pressing against the walls. Samuel says the thermometer showed 42 below this morning before the mercury itself rose. We burn and burn, but the heat seems to flee our cabin almost as quickly as the stove produces it. The children sleep in our bed now, all of us huddled for warmth despite the fire that Samuel tends through the night. I fear for the animals in the barn, though Samuel has moved the most vulnerable into the storage room adjacent to the kitchen, where some heat might reach them. This entry captures the desperate measures that many families were forced to adopt. Despite massive wood consumption, their cabins remained perilously cold. The fundamental inefficiency of their heating approach, powerful but uncontained heat, quickly lost through poorly insulated structures, created a situation where no amount of fuel seemed adequate. On the 10th day of the cold snap, Samuel was awakened before dawn by a pounding at his door. It was Eric Paulson, one of the younger settlers, his face gaunt with exhaustion and worry. "Fire's dying," he gasped as Samuel let him in. "Used the last of my good wood yesterday. Been burning furniture since midnight." It was a situation every settler dreaded, running out of fuel midwinter with no way to replenish supplies. Within hours, 4 men from neighboring cabins had gathered what wood they could spare, but the harsh reality was evident. Their own supplies were running dangerously low, depleted by the constant feeding of inefficient stoves. Eric Paulson's situation was particularly dire. A newcomer who had arrived just the previous spring, he had limited experience with frontier winters. His wood stockpile had seemed ample by the standards he knew from his native Ohio, but proved woefully inadequate for Montana's harsh conditions. With a wife and infant son depending on him, the prospect of a cold cabin was not merely uncomfortable, but potentially fatal. "Thatcher," Jacob suggested after a long silence. "He's been burning steady, but slow. Might have reserves." Pride warred with necessity as the men considered the option. Asking for help from the newcomer whose methods they'd mocked would be difficult, but winter survival transcended pride. The decision to approach Josiah represented a significant moment in the community's development. Frontier societies often developed rigid hierarchies and resistance to outside ideas, partially as defense mechanisms in environments where mistakes could be fatal. For the established settlers to seek help from a newcomer whose methods they had dismissed required both humility and the pragmatism that ultimately characterized successful frontier communities. Samuel and Jacob made the difficult journey to Josiah's cabin through waist-deep snowdrifts. They arrived to find him seated at his workbench, sketching designs by the light of a small window. The cabin was remarkably warm, with the small Vermont stove radiating steady heat despite containing what appeared to be just a few small logs. "Eric Paulson's run out of wood," Samuel said without preamble. "Most of us are getting low. This cold spell's burning through our supplies faster than expected." Josiah nodded, setting aside his work. "I've been wondering when someone might come by. How many households are struggling?" "At least 5 by my count," Jacob said. "Maybe more soon if this weather holds." What followed was not the reluctant charity the men had expected, but rather a calm assessment and plan. Josiah revealed that his careful woodpile management and efficient stove had left him with substantial reserves. But more importantly, he offered something beyond mere supplies. "The stove makes the difference," he explained, opening the small iron door to reveal an ingenious internal design. "The air flows through these channels, heating the metal more effectively, burns the smoke too for extra heat, and the cabin's double wall construction keeps the warmth from escaping." The interior of the stove revealed a complexity that Samuel had never considered. Rather than a simple box where wood burned, Josiah's stove contained carefully arranged metal plates and air passages that created a sophisticated combustion system. The fire itself burned in a small, intensely hot chamber lined with fire brick, while air was precisely directed to ensure complete combustion and maximum heat transfer to the stove's exterior. "This main chamber is where the primary burn happens," Josiah explained, pointing to the central portion of the stove. "But the real efficiency comes from what happens to the gases afterward. See these channels here? They force the hot gases to travel a longer path before reaching the chimney, giving up more heat to the metal which radiates into the room." He demonstrated how the damper system could precisely control airflow, allowing the fire to burn hotter or cooler as needed while maintaining efficiency at all settings. The technical sophistication developed over decades by Vermont stove makers stood in stark contrast to the crude, inefficient designs that dominated frontier settlements. "The whole system works together," Josiah continued, moving from the stove to the walls of his cabin. He showed how the double wall construction created an insulating air pocket, while careful sealing at joints and around openings prevented the heat leakage that plagued most frontier cabins. "In the East, we learned these methods through necessity," he explained. "Wood got scarcer as more land was cleared for farming. Had to make every log count." The 3 men spent hours discussing principles of heat efficiency that had been developed back east, but hadn't yet reached this remote territory. Josiah shared detailed notes he'd made during his first years in Vermont, showing fuel consumption rates compared to traditional methods. By evening, a plan had formed. Under Josiah's guidance, emergency modifications would be made to the struggling cabins, simple alterations to existing stoves using sheet metal to create rudimentary baffles, combined with strategic insulation of walls using available materials. The technical improvisation that followed demonstrated the adaptive ingenuity that characterized frontier communities at their best. Without access to new stoves or specialized materials, the settlers would need to modify their existing equipment using whatever was available. Josiah's background as a skilled carpenter and his understanding of heating principles made him the ideal person to lead this effort. "We can't recreate my stove exactly," he explained as they gathered materials, "but we can improve what you have significantly with some basic changes." The plan they developed focused on 3 key areas. 1. Modifying existing stoves by adding internal baffles made from sheet metal, forcing the heat to take a longer path before exiting through the chimney. 2. Improving cabin insulation by packing available materials, from clay to dried grass, into wall spaces and sealing gaps around doors and windows. 3. Adjusting firing techniques to maintain a smaller, hotter fire rather than the large, fuel-hungry blazes that were common practice. The next 2 weeks transformed Pine Ridge. As word spread about Josiah's methods, the community's initial skepticism gave way to pragmatic acceptance. Men who had mocked his tiny stove now carefully followed his instructions, creating makeshift heat shields and reconfiguring their stoves to burn more efficiently. Eric Paulson's cabin became the first test case. Using metal from spare tools and clay from the creek bed, they modified his stove according to Josiah's designs. The improvement was immediate. The cabin maintained a livable temperature with less than half the previous fuel consumption. The modifications to the Paulson cabin documented in Josiah's journal included: created a baffle system using sheet metal from an old water tank, forcing the smoke to travel horizontally before rising to the chimney. Sealed gaps around windows with a mixture of clay and horsehair. Added a secondary air intake above the fire chamber to improve combustion of gases. Results exceeded expectations. Cabin temperature rose from 40 degrees to 58 degrees within 2 hours, using only half the wood previously required. The success with the Paulson cabin created momentum that carried through the community. Over the next 10 days, similar modifications were made to 6 more cabins, each building on the lessons learned from previous efforts. Jakob Miller proved particularly adept at adapting Josiah's techniques, drawing on half-remembered methods from his European childhood. "My grandfather would be pleased," Jakob told Josiah, as they completed work on the Donovan cabin. "He always said Americans waste wood like they expect forests to grow overnight." The German immigrant's comment highlighted an important cultural difference that underpinned the different approaches to resource use. The American frontier experience had indeed been shaped by an abundance of resources that seemed inexhaustible. European settlers, by contrast, came from a continent where centuries of dense population had necessitated more careful resource management. Josiah's methods represented a bridge between these worldviews, applying the conservation mindset of the Old World and older Eastern settlements to the resource-rich frontier. Samuel Donovan's experience with the modified heating system in his own cabin marked a turning point in his perspective. His journal entry from January 24, 1877, reveals the impact, third night, with Thatcher's modifications to our stove and walls. "The difference confounds me still. Our main room maintains comfortable warmth with less than half the wood we burned before. Emma reports the bedroom is warm enough that the children sleep without extra blankets. Most surprising is the evenness of the heat, no more blazing hot near the stove and freezing by the walls. I find myself wondering what other established practices might benefit from reconsideration." This last sentence captures a profound shift in thinking, an openness to questioning methods that had been accepted as unassailable frontier wisdom. It represented the beginning of a more adaptive approach to frontier life that would come to characterize Pine Ridge in the years ahead. The Great Freezing finally broke in early February, but its lessons remained. By the time spring arrived, Pine Ridge had begun a quiet revolution in construction and heating methods. Samuel Donovan, once Josiah's most vocal critic, became an unlikely convert, meticulously documenting the fuel savings in his personal journal, records that would later be preserved in the County Historical Society. "Saved 16 cords over previous winter," he wrote, in an entry dated April 4, 1877. Thatcher's method sound. "Pride nearly froze us all." The transformation in Pine Ridge extended beyond heating techniques to encompass broader attitudes about frontier adaptation. The settlement had begun with the common frontier approach of attempting to impose familiar methods on an unfamiliar environment. Josiah's influence shifted this dynamic toward a more responsive relationship with the local conditions, working with environmental realities rather than simply struggling against them. Spring brought the usual burst of activity to the settlement, but with a different focus than previous years. Rather than immediately returning to field work and hunting, many families devoted time to improving their cabins based on what they had learned during the winter crisis. The modified stoves, initially viewed as emergency measures, were now refined and permanently installed. New construction incorporated double-wall techniques and better insulation from the outset. The community's enhanced resilience became evident when an unexpected late blizzard struck in early April. In previous years, such storms had caused significant hardship, as depleted wood supplies and weather-worn cabins provided inadequate protection. This time, the improved efficiency of their heating systems meant that remaining wood supplies were more than adequate, and better insulated cabins maintained comfortable temperatures despite the howling winds outside. As summer approached, Josiah found his role in the community transformed. Once viewed with skepticism as an impractical Easterner, he was now sought out for advice on a range of practical matters. His background as a skilled carpenter made him particularly valuable in a settlement where most construction was done by generalists with limited specialized knowledge. The small workshop adjacent to his cabin became an informal gathering place where settlers would bring projects and problems. Josiah's methodical approach, carefully analyzing challenges and applying systematic solutions, provided a valuable complement to the more improvisational frontier methods that prevailed in the settlement. By midsummer, discussion had turned to preparing for the coming winter. Rather than simply planning to cut more wood, as had been the practice in previous years, the community now focused on improving heating efficiency and building design. Several families decided to invest in new stoves, ordering them from Eastern manufacturers based on Josiah's recommendations. The following winter, 6 cabins in Pine Ridge featured Vermont-style stoves, shipped at considerable expense from manufacturers back east. By 1880, the settlement had established its own metalworking shop capable of producing similar designs locally, creating a minor industry that supplied neighboring communities. This development represented more than just a practical improvement in heating technology. It marked a significant economic shift for the settlement, diversifying beyond the agricultural and hunting activities that dominated most frontier economies. The metalworking shop, initially focused on stove production, eventually expanded to create a range of specialized tools and equipment adapted to local conditions. Jakob Müller's son, Friedrich, became particularly involved in this emerging industry. Having apprenticed with a blacksmith before coming to America, he possessed skills that complemented Josiah's design knowledge. Together, they refined the stove designs based on practical experience in Montana conditions, creating what became known as the Pine Ridge Heater, a hybrid design that incorporated elements of Eastern efficiency with adaptations for frontier realities. The technical documentation of these developments, preserved in the territorial archives, provides fascinating insights into how innovation occurred on the frontier. Friedrich Müller's careful technical drawings show the evolution of the stove design over several years, with each iteration incorporating refinements based on user feedback and observed performance. By 1882, the Pine Ridge Heater had gained recognition beyond the immediate area. A territorial fair in Helena awarded it a certificate of merit for ingenious adaptation of established principles to frontier conditions, and orders began coming in from settlements throughout Montana and neighboring territories. The economic impact of this development was significant for Pine Ridge. The metalworking shop employed 5 workers by 1883, creating skilled jobs that were rare in frontier settlements. The income from stove sales provided a valuable supplement to agricultural revenues, helping to stabilize the community's economy during the inevitable years when crops failed or prices fell. Moreover, the reputation for practical innovation attracted new settlers with valuable skills. Between 1880 and 1885, the population of Pine Ridge nearly doubled, with many newcomers specifically citing the community's progressive reputation as a factor in their decision to settle there. These demographic changes brought new dimensions to Pine Ridge's development. Among the newcomers was Dr. Henry Wilson, a physician from Philadelphia who had grown weary of urban practice and sought a frontier community where his skills would be valued. His arrival in 1883 marked a significant improvement in the settlement's medical care, previously limited to folk remedies and the occasional visit from a traveling doctor. Dr. Trout. Wilson's medical journal from this period contains interesting observations on the health implications of the improved heating systems. Having practiced in several frontier settlements, I am struck by the comparative absence of respiratory complaints in Pine Ridge during winter months. The common winter afflictions of persistent cough, bronchial irritation, and various lung inflammations appear significantly reduced here. I attribute this primarily to the superior heating and ventilation systems in local dwellings, which produce more consistent temperatures and far less smoke than is typical in frontier homes. This observation highlights a benefit of the improved heating technology that extended beyond comfort and fuel efficiency to encompass public health. The reduced smoke production of the more efficient stoves meant better air quality inside cabins, while the more consistent heating eliminated the extreme temperature fluctuations common in poorly insulated dwellings. The social fabric of Pine Ridge also evolved in response to these material improvements. With less time needed for constant wood gathering and fire tending, community members had more opportunity for other activities. The settlement established a small library in 1884, initially housed in a corner of the community meeting hall, with books contributed by residents or ordered from Eastern publishers. Emma Donovan, who took on the role of informal librarian, noted in her diary, "It seems a small thing, perhaps, to have books available during the long winter evenings. Yet I observe how this modest collection has sparked conversation and learning throughout our community." Last night, a discussion of Mr. Darwin's theories continued until nearly midnight, with perspectives offered from the most unexpected quarters. This entry captures how the practical improvements in heating technology had ripple effects through the community's cultural and intellectual life. With warm, comfortable spaces available throughout the winter and less time consumed by mere survival, the settlers could engage in the kinds of social and intellectual activities that created a more vibrant community. The educational dimension was particularly important. The settlement's small schoolhouse, previously closed for extended periods during the harshest winter weather, could now operate consistently through the season. The teacher, Sarah Mitchell, noted in her annual report to the Territorial Education Office, "The improved heating of our schoolhouse has resulted in near-perfect attendance throughout the winter months, a marked change from previous years. The children arrive warm and ready to learn, rather than half-frozen and distracted by discomfort." Josiah Thatcher's innovative approach wasn't merely about a stove design. It represented a fundamentally different philosophy of frontier life, one that valued careful planning and efficiency over brute force solutions. His double-walled cabin construction incorporated principles that had evolved over centuries in the harsh winters of northern Europe and New England, where fuel scarcity had long been a reality. The technical details of Josiah's stove design were particularly fascinating to those who studied it closely. Unlike the conventional stoves of the period, which were essentially iron boxes where wood burned quickly and much of the heat escaped directly up the chimney, his model featured a complex internal baffle system. This forced the hot gases from combustion to travel a longer path before exiting, allowing more heat to be absorbed by the iron and radiated into the room. Moreover, his stove included a secondary combustion chamber where partially burned gases, what would normally escape as smoke, were mixed with a small amount of preheated air and burned again. This two-stage burning process extracted nearly twice the heat energy from each log while producing significantly less smoke and creosote buildup in the chimney, a common cause of dangerous chimney fires in frontier cabins. The story of what happened in Pine Ridge that winter began to spread throughout the territory. By 1878, travelers passing through the settlement often made special trips to see the Thatcher stove for themselves. A reporter from the Helena Weekly Herald visited in the autumn of 1878, publishing a detailed account titled "Eastern Innovation Meets Western Necessity: The Revolutionary Heating Methods of Pine Ridge." The article caught the attention of Marcus Daly, one of Montana Territory's emerging copper kings, who was planning the development of worker housing for his expanding mining operations. Recognizing the potential for significant cost savings in fuel consumption, Daly dispatched his chief engineer to Pine Ridge to study the stove design and cabin construction methods. By 1879, the Pine Ridge method, as it became known, was being incorporated into new construction throughout the territory's mining communities. The double-walled construction technique, using an outer and inner wall with a dead airspace between, proved particularly valuable in the harsh conditions of mountain mining towns. In the spring of 1880, Josiah Thatcher received an unexpected letter from the Patent Office in Washington. A former territorial representative, impressed by the stove design during a visit to Montana, had submitted Josiah's name for consideration of a patent award. The letter invited him to provide detailed specifications and drawings for official registration. This recognition brought both pride and reflection to the community of Pine Ridge. What had begun as mockery of an outsider's strange ways had evolved into respect for wisdom that transcended regional boundaries. The frontier, they were learning, wasn't just about enduring hardship through sheer force of will, but about adapting intelligently to challenges. The formal documentation of Josiah's stove design, preserved in the Territorial Archives and later transferred to the Montana Historical Society, provides fascinating insights into the evolution of heating technology on the frontier. His original drawings, meticulously rendered in ink on parchment, show the key innovations that made his stove so effective. 1. A primary combustion chamber lined with fire brick that retained and radiated heat long after the active fire had diminished. 2. A series of cast iron baffles that created a serpentine path for hot gases, maximizing heat transfer to the stove's exterior. 3. A carefully calculated secondary air intake that introduced preheated oxygen to burn residual gases that would otherwise be wasted as smoke. 4. A precision-engineered damper system that allowed for minute adjustments of airflow, enabling the stove to maintain a steady temperature with minimal attention. 5. A compact design that minimized the stove's footprint while maximizing its heating efficiency, making it ideal for frontier cabins where space was at a premium. What made this stove particularly remarkable for its time was how it addressed the specific challenges of frontier life. Most settlers arrived with limited resources and faced immediate needs for shelter and heat before winter set in. The common response was to build quickly and burn excessive amounts of wood, a seemingly abundant resource in many areas. But Josiah, drawing on generations of Eastern wisdom, recognized that proper preparation and efficient design could dramatically reduce both labor and resource consumption. Each log burned in his stove produced nearly twice the usable heat of the same wood burned in conventional designs. This meant fewer hours spent chopping and hauling wood, less time tending fires, and more time for productive work even during the harshest weather. The documentation that survives from this period reveals the wide-ranging impact of these innovations. Samuel Donovan's journal, spanning the years 1875 to 1892, provides perhaps the most detailed account of how Pine Ridge was transformed by what he came to call Thatcher's wisdom. March 15, 1880. Third winter. With modified stove and improved walls, he wrote. Cut only 8 cords this year compared to 30 before the changes. Emma no longer complains of drafts by her rocker, and the children sleep through the night without needing extra blankets. The improved comfort alone would justify the effort, but the time saved in wood gathering has allowed me to finish the new barn and begin work on the expanded root cellar. Thatcher was right. Efficiency creates opportunity. Walter Keene, once the most vocal critic of Josiah's methods, underwent perhaps the most dramatic conversion. By 1881, he had not only adopted the stove design, but had begun experimenting with additional improvements. His innovation of a small water reservoir attached to the stove's rear wall provided humidification for the dry winter air while offering a constant supply of warm water for household use, a luxury on the frontier that significantly improved comfort during the long winter months. The technical innovation sparked by Josiah's stove extended beyond heating to other aspects of frontier life. The principles of efficiency and careful design began to influence everything from food storage techniques to livestock management. By 1883, Pine Ridge had developed a reputation throughout the territory as a community of unusual prosperity and resilience. The territorial governor, visiting in the summer of 1883, remarked in his official correspondence to Washington that Pine Ridge represented a model of frontier adaptation worthy of emulation throughout the Western Territories. Their innovative approaches to resource conservation and community cooperation have produced remarkable results in a challenging environment. The history of Pine Ridge might have remained a mere footnote in Montana's territorial development, were it not for the devastating winter of 1886-87, which later became known as the Great Die-Up. That winter brought unprecedented cold and snow to the northern plains, decimating cattle herds and bankrupting many ranchers who had failed to prepare adequate shelter and feed. The true severity of that winter is preserved in territorial weather records and personal accounts from throughout the region. Temperatures reached 63 degrees below zero in some areas, with snowdrifts exceeding 20 feet in depth. The combination of extreme cold and heavy snow made normal activities impossible and threatened the survival of humans and livestock alike. A letter from a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Assiniboine captures the conditions. I have experienced winter campaigns in the Dakota Territory and served in the mountains of Colorado, but never have I witnessed cold of such sustained severity. Our thermometer ceased functioning when the mercury froze solid at 40 below zero. Horses refuse to leave the stable, and men venture outside only in the direst necessity, wrapped so thoroughly they resemble walking bundles of wool and fur, rather than soldiers. The catastrophic impact on cattle ranching was particularly significant for Montana's economic development. The open range system, with cattle left to fend for themselves during winter months, proved catastrophically vulnerable to such extreme conditions. Contemporary accounts describe cattle standing frozen in place, starving animals staggering through villages in search of food, and spring revealing carcasses by the thousands as the snow receded. Pine Ridge, with its efficient heating systems and well-insulated buildings, weathered the catastrophic winter better than most communities. When spring finally arrived, revealing the devastating losses suffered throughout the region, the territorial government dispatched representatives to study Pine Ridge's methods. The comprehensive report submitted to the territorial legislature in May 1887 laid out in detail the principles that had allowed Pine Ridge to survive: efficient heating technology, strategic insulation techniques, cooperative resource management, and a community ethic that balanced individual initiative with collective welfare. The events at Pine Ridge demonstrate conclusively that frontier survival demands not merely courage and endurance, but intelligent adaptation and efficient resource utilization, the report concluded. The lessons learned in this small settlement should inform policy and practice throughout the territory. Josiah Thatcher, by then approaching his 51st year, found himself unexpectedly elevated to the role of territorial consultant, traveling to communities throughout Montana to demonstrate his stove design and construction methods. The territorial governor authorized funding for a series of instructional pamphlets with detailed illustrations of the stove's construction and operating principles to be distributed to new settlements. These pamphlets, titled Efficient Frontier Heating: The Thatcher Method, survive today in several museum collections, offering a remarkable window into how practical knowledge was disseminated on the frontier. The detailed technical drawings, accompanied by clear instructions that could be understood even by those with limited literacy, represent an early example of public education focused on practical sustainability. The legacy of Pine Ridge's heating revolution extended far beyond the immediate practical benefits. It represented a fundamental shift in how frontier communities approached resource management and adaptation to environmental challenges. Rather than seeing the harsh climate as an enemy to be conquered through brute force, Josiah's approach demonstrated how thoughtful design and efficiency could transform challenges into opportunities. This philosophical shift was perhaps best articulated by Samuel Donovan in an address to new settlers arriving in the spring of 1888. "We came to this valley believing that conquest of nature was our task, and that enduring hardship was the mark of frontier character. What we've learned is that working with nature's principles, rather than against them, produces not just greater comfort, but greater prosperity. True frontier wisdom lies not in how much hardship you can endure, but in how intelligently you can avoid unnecessary suffering." The community's evolution reflected broader changes occurring throughout the American West during this period. The frontier was transitioning from its early phase of exploration and raw settlement to a more established society with increasingly sophisticated infrastructure and institutions. Pine Ridge's experience represented a microcosm of this larger transformation. The shift from survival-focused improvisation to thoughtful, sustainable development. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Pine Ridge was specifically mentioned in several newspaper editorials as exemplifying the kind of practical innovation and community cooperation that would serve the new state well as it developed. "The frontier has long been romanticized as a place where individualism reigns supreme," wrote the editor of the Helena Independent in November 1889. But the true story of our territorial development, as exemplified by communities like Pine Ridge, is one of cooperative adaptation and shared knowledge. It is on such foundations that our new state will prosper. Josiah Thatcher lived to see Montana's transition to statehood and continued to refine his designs until his death in the winter of 1905. According to local accounts, he passed peacefully in his sleep in his cabin, which remained warm throughout the night despite the fire having burned down 2 embers. A final testament to the efficiency of his heating system. His funeral, held during a bitter January cold snap, brought together nearly the entire community of Pine Ridge, by then grown to over 60 households. Samuel Donovan, his once skeptical neighbor who had become a close friend and collaborator, delivered a eulogy that captured the profound impact of Josiah's innovations. "He came to us as a stranger, with methods we did not understand and ideas we were quick to dismiss. Yet through quiet persistence rather than forceful argument, through demonstration rather than demand, he changed not just how we heat our homes, but how we think about living on this frontier. His legacy is not merely in the warmth of our cabins, but in the warmth of our community, forged through shared wisdom and mutual respect." The historical significance of Josiah Thatcher and the Pine Ridge heating revolution has been reassessed by modern historians, who see in this small frontier episode larger themes about technology transfer, environmental adaptation, and the evolution of sustainable practices. Dr. Eleanor Sanderson, professor of Western American History at Montana State University, notes, "The Pine Ridge case study challenges our stereotypical narratives about frontier development. Rather than the usual story of environmental exploitation and resource depletion, we see a community that quickly evolved toward what we would now call sustainable practices. They weren't motivated by environmental idealism, but by practical necessity, yet the outcome was a system that was remarkably efficient and low impact." The original Thatcher stove design has been recognized by engineering historians as a significant innovation in American heating technology. In 2010, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated it as a historic mechanical engineering landmark, noting its influence on the development of more efficient wood-burning technologies in the late 19th century. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Pine Ridge's heating revolution is found not in museums or history books, but in the vernacular architecture of Montana. Throughout the state's rural areas, examples of the double-walled construction technique pioneered by Josiah Thatcher can still be found in buildings dating from the 1880s through the early 1900s. These structures, many still in use today, stand as physical testaments to how a single innovation can shape a region's development for generations. The story of Pine Ridge offers valuable lessons for our own era. As we grapple with questions of resource management, energy efficiency, and community resilience, It reminds us that innovation often emerges from the meeting of different knowledge traditions. In this case, the resource conservation mindset of established Eastern settlements and the practical adaptability of frontier communities. More fundamentally, it challenges us to reconsider what constitutes true frontier wisdom. The popular mythology of the American West often emphasizes rugged individualism and brute force confrontation with natural challenges. The Pine Ridge experience suggests a more nuanced reality, where community cooperation and intelligent adaptation to environmental conditions played crucial roles in frontier success. As we face contemporary challenges of resource management and environmental sustainability, the story of Pine Ridge offers a compelling historical example of how innovation, community cooperation, and practical wisdom can transform seemingly insurmountable challenges into opportunities for growth. The winter of 1877 wasn't just about a stove that provided unexpected heat. It was about a community that discovered how innovation and tradition could work together, how the careful application of knowledge could multiply limited resources, and how sometimes the most valuable survival tool is simply the willingness to reconsider what you believe to be true. As we face our own modern challenges of resource management and adaptation, perhaps there's something to be learned from Josiah's small stove and the skeptical neighbors who eventually gathered around it. That preparation trumps bravado, that efficiency often outperforms brute force, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can say is simply, "There might be a better way."